Welcome to another English Journey episode, reading by J.B. Priestley. I'm Richard Vobes, the Bald Explorer, and here we all are. Good morning to Mark Donny McLeod. Good morning to Linda, who's got here for the first time, and to Turbo Stream, Adrian, and the lovely Julia. Mark Donny McLeod, good moaning. Bit parky. It is a bit parky here too, actually. Few more cyclists out this morning than usual, I think. Spied 6 or 7 brand new machines too. Yeah, I bet bike sales are very, I was going to say going through the roof, but they're probably not going through the roof, but they're probably very good at the moment. Thought I'd just start a little earlier, a couple of minutes earlier. And whilst waiting for other people to come along, this arrived yesterday, which is another book. It's called Priestley's England, J.B. Priestley and English Culture. So this is not by Priestley, by somebody called John Baxendale. And it says on the back here, Priestley's England is a first full-length academic study. I always worry when they say academic because that could mean boring. Of J.B. Priestley, novelist, playwright, screenwriter, journalist and broadcaster, political activist, public intellectual and popular entertainer, one of the makers of the 20th century Britain and one of its sharpest critics. From his scathing analysis of a slump-ridden nation in the best-selling English Journey, which is what we're reading, to his popular wartime broadcasts, which have paved the way to 1945 and the welfare state, his post-war critique of ADMAS and the Cold War, he was a founder of CND, and his continual engagement with the question of Englishness, Priestley addresses the key issues of the century from a radical standpoint in fiction, journalism and plays, which appeared to a wide audience and made him one of the most successful writers in his day. So that's him. This book explores the cultural, literacy and political history of the 20th century through the themes which preoccupied Priestley throughout his life. Competing versions of Englishness, tradition, modernity and the decline of the industrial England. Americanization, mass culture, and ADMAS. I'm not quite sure what ADMAS is. Cultural values and broad brow culture. Consumerism and the decay of the public sphere, the loss of spirituality and community, and the nervous excitement, the frenzy, the underlying despair of our century. It argues that Priestley has been unjustly neglected for too long. We have a great deal to learn both from this extraordinary multifaceted man and from the English radical tradition he represented. So that's pretty much what this book is. As he says, it's not an autobiography and it's not really a history, but it's an examination of the culture of the time. And I've only read a few pages because the trouble is I've got so many damn books. And if you keep reading a book every time it arrives, you're only going to get through a few pages of each one. But it's fascinating to be reading a bit of that whilst finishing off English Journey. And it does sort of put a few things in the perspective. We remind ourselves that this is the Depression, the Great Depression. Ben Reeve, good morning. From a current dry Buckinghamshire. I'm glad it's dry. It is dry here down on the south. It's just overcast, a bit blustery, and just sort of not one thing or the other, really. Ramiboo is there. Hey, I finally got an alert for the show. Woohoo! I don't know. It's nothing to do with me, these alerts, you know. Dean Cooper, good morning. Good morning, Dean. Fiona Hammond, good morning. Mike Barrack, good morning. Or Barack. Oh, Brack, is it? Is that Brack? Two A's. Brack. Is it Brack? Curious on pronunciations of people's surnames. Obviously, are not always obvious. Well, certainly not to me, and I don't mean to get them wrong on purpose. Phil Hammond. That's easy enough to pronounce. Good morning. Mark Donny McLeod, good morning. And everybody's saying good morning. The book should keep you occupied while drinking that nice tea you have. Yes, Cheers. Absolutely. I may have another go at making bread later today. I've got some editing to do, but right, out comes Priestley's England, or rather his English journey, rather. There's a lovely picture. Look at that lovely picture. Oh, no, you can't, can you? That's a nice old picture. Some old duffer that... Why isn't that doing it? Some old duffer there with a big barrel and his bowler hat. Or derby hat. Right, where are we? Where are we? Are we nearly there yet? Yes, we're nearly there. We are to Lincoln and Norfolk. He's in Hull at the moment. I know it's not you. It's that dastardly YouTube deciding for me. That's right. Linda Kane was going to look, but I thought I'd leave it to you. Yes, good. Okay, so last time we were down on the docks, I think, at Hull, and I think that's where we're going to pick him up. Later in the day, with sheets of rain still falling outside, I smoked a pipe or two in the private office of one of the oldest firms of shipping agents and talked to its senior director. I just say that I think, this is... When he was doing this journey, because he was a well-known author, even then in his mid to late 30s, I think, as somebody pointed out, he was about 39, I think. And he started writing at a very early age and was writing newspapers and stuff. I was reading a bit about him in the other book. And this became a seminal work or a landmark work. And clearly he had the luck and the organisation. I mean, he makes it sound like he just sort of breezes into the office to talk to these people. But of course, all of this must have been pre-arranged, and he had an itinerary and probably a secretary back in London from the publishers arranging all of this. But of course, you don't get that sense at all. He just, it just seems to just pop in, which would make following in his footsteps not an easy task, to do those same sort of things and have similar conversations, because you couldn't just waft in with a GoPro camera and talk to the senior, whatever it is, the private office of one of the ships and talk to the senior director. They just wouldn't give you the time of day, especially if you're an unknown thing. But anyway, so there he goes. He goes in, talks to the senior director. He was, as they all are, a Hull man, and began by talking about the changes he had known. Among other things, he told me that in his youth, the smaller coasting ports really had an authentic W. Jacobs flavour, whoever W. Jacobs is, although no enemy of the railway company and appreciative of its enterprise, he disliked its position of the docks, which should, he declared, be under the control of the Harbour Board, as in London. He also condemned the recent development in town planning that had resulted, here as elsewhere, in the creation of new workmen's quarters outside the town. The men, especially the dockers, should have been rehoused in their old districts, within a stone throw of their work. Most of the dockers have no regular employment. They have to stand a ship, which means going down to the dock to see if they're wanted early in the morning and then again in the afternoon. If there's no work for them on the morning shift, they can do nothing until the afternoon. When they lived close at hand, they could stand the ship on a cold winter's morning and return at once to their firesides if not wanted, and keep warm and dry until they tried again in the afternoon. But now that they live a bus or tram ride away, they do not want to make the long journey back home if there's nothing for them in the morning, and so they hang about, or alternatively spend money that they can ill afford on shelter and hot food and drink until the afternoon. Thus, they're worse off than they were before, simply because they've been removed so far from their work. Their womenfolk easily grumble about it. This all seems sound reasoning as far as it goes, though it is rather pitiful that, first, dockers cannot be paid enough to make a twopenny bus fare no great matter, and that, second, in these days of telephones, it should be necessary that they would have to travel several miles without knowing whether they're required or not. I would have thought, in my ignorance, that if a fairly large number of dockers had been rehoused together outside the city, a little elementary organisation both ends, a telephone message or two from the docks to some little office where the men live, could soon put an end to these futile journeys and this waiting about in the cold and wet. But there may be, of course, difficulties that I do not understand. In any event, there is a good deal to be said in favour of building on old sites instead of going outside a long way from places of work and there destroying a good piece of country. We ought to make up our minds and use all the space inside our towns, without overcrowding, of course, and then to keep as much possible for the surrounding countryside and keep as much as possible the surrounding countryside unspoilt. For my part, I would much rather live in the centre of town and have quick access to unspoilt country than live in a wide wilderness of little bungalows in neither honest town or country. My acquaintance, the shipping agent, went on to say that a foreign friend of his had just been criticising our habit of living outside the cities in which we work. "You people," said this foreigner, "should have bungalows and cottages in the country where you could spend 2 or 3 months in the summer, as we do, but then the rest of the time, especially in winter, you should live here in Hull. You could then have a good social life." My acquaintance, who lives in the country himself, confessed that there was something in this criticism, and admitted that he and his wife knew little of the social life they had once known. As there were a great many others, substantial citizens, who lived a long way from the city, the social life of the place is not what it had been. And this habit, he pointed out, had a bad effect on many things, notably the theatre. He himself had been a constant play-goer in the old days, but now that he lived so far away, he rarely stayed in the city to visit a theatre. And there were dozens like him, all of them men of standing and comfortably off. It was he himself who pointed out how bad this was, but I was quick to agree with him. I think the foreign critic was right. It would be much better if our provincial citizens lived in their cities, except during the summer months, instead of merely working in them. The habit of living outside, which owes much of its growth to the increase of motors, explains in part the social disintegration that one notices in so many provincial cities. The very people who at one time would have been the chief supporters of local music and drama and so forth now spend their evenings with bridge and wireless 25 miles away. That is one reason why the provincial theatre is not what it was. The competition of cinema has, of course, done something, and so have the cheap, bad touring companies. But the fact that the richer citizens no longer live in the city partly explains the decline. There is an excellent little repertory theatre in Hull, but it has a hard struggle to keep going. In spite of so many prophecies to the contrary, we are now less urban than our fathers and grandfathers were. The country gentleman tradition is livelier today than it was 25 years ago, and I understand that there are far more people hunting now than there were before the war. Men of the director or manager kind have moved, or are moving, out of the city and tend to be interested only in it as a place in which to earn money. I've noticed in more and more big provincial town that the old residential districts, the one which the solid citizens lived in comfortable rows, have fallen from majesty and grace and are given up to dentistry, corsets, boarders and estate agent boards. The result is the various social and artistic activities of those towns are now chiefly organised by people who belong to the employed and not the employing class, people who cannot afford to live miles away and who also cannot afford to spend much money on these activities. A further result is that these activities themselves are taking on a new character. For example, the only theatre that is really alive in many of these towns is one in which speeches that challenge the existing order of things receive the loudest applause. Thus, I suspect that this retreat of the wealthier and more conservative classes from full urban life in the provinces may produce, probably already is producing, some curious results which will ultimately be more distressing to those classes than to the rest of us. It's interesting he's got this big interest in theatre because he used to write lots of plays. Oh, here we go. Diane Patterson. Hello, Diana Patterson, beg your pardon. William Wymark Jacobs was an English author of short stories and novels. During his career, he is best known for his farcical comedies involving dockside and rural Essex characters. Oh, there we go. Thank you very much. That's what I love about this reading, is it revealed that I can look at something that, normally you may not bother to spend the time to look up, and somebody's done it for you, which is fantastic. Thank you very much. Next morning, I was up in good time, for I had arranged to go around the fish market. Oh, he does choose the most exciting things, doesn't he? They claim that it is the finest in the world. Most of us still think Grimsby as the preeminent fishy place, but now Hull beats Grimsby for sheer quantity, if not quality. Last year's catch approximately weighed 215,000 tonnes, and it was sold for over £2.5 million sterling. Fishing is the biggest industry of the city. Its fleet of trawlers are very up-to-date, long-distance craft which use wireless, direction finders, depth-sounding apparatus, and every other scientific device that can possibly help them to reap the deep seas. So off we went, through a raw morning, to St. Andrew's Docks. It was cold on the way, and it seemed colder still when we arrived there and found ourselves surrounded by dead fish, ice, and blue-handed porters. It was not, I was promptly told, a good morning. It looked good enough for me, for it did not look as if there could not be a cod left in the northern seas. On one side was a misty and pleasing confusion of masts and funnels, finely tangled in the silvery mesh of the morning, and on the other, where we were standing, was the tremendous perspective of kits, the open wooden barrels, about 3 foot deep, in which the fish is packed after it's been sorted. We looked down on an apparent infinity of cod and codlings. But before making their near acquaintance, I was taken round the central building of the market. Hull is very proud of this building. It contains the merchants' offices, banks, railway offices, and a post office. I had to inspect all of these, which were not very different from the various offices one sees elsewhere, except that they were surrounded by leagues of dead fish, and their hours are not the same. They must open in the small hours, and a very cold, dark business it must be too, and I suppose when I looked in upon them, it was well past noon. Fantastic working hours of this kind have an atmosphere of their own. I believe that if I were a clerk, I would prefer them to ordinary hours. To set out for work in the very black of the night, to see the dawn break over the cash book, to be finishing when the other fellows are just settling down for a day's grind, all this would please me, give me the job urgency and romantic flavour. You would always feel that you were working somewhere between Christmas Eve and the declaration of war, and not least, these must be jobs at which you have to be sustained by frequent cups of tea. The room I liked best, however, was the Trawlers Owners and Merchants Club, which smelled cosily of sausages and cigars, and had a chart in it showing the position of all the trawlers still out. After eating your sausage, which you had earned, having been up since before dawn, you light your cigar and stand in front of the chart, wondering how the Annie Brown is getting on somewhere in the Merman coast. I remember reading a novel in which the hero, in the very first chapter, rebelled against being a wholesale fish merchant like his uncle, on the ground that such a career was too painfully prosaic. The novelist can never have known anything about fish merchants. He ought to visit Hull. You can justly object to this fishy life because it is too wildly romantic and speculative and keeps such queer hours, but it is monstrous to suggest that it is prosaic. It offers you a better gamble than Monte Carlo and a more poetic atmosphere. Yeah, I'm sure it does. We descended into the actual market among the ranged kits. It was very raw down there among the cod and codling and the ice and salt. The breath of the Arctic was stinging our cheeks. We might, too, have just been off the coast of Merman. Cod of every size possible easily dominated the morning's catch. I saw only a few halibut, but these were of gigantic size, lying there like murdered Roman emperors. What a pity that it is generous fish. What a pity it is that this generous fish is not so exciting to taste as it is to look at, blanched in death. And there's a picture here that's worth just briefly looking at because it shows you fish at St Andrew's Dock in 1935. And again, I've got the glare of the light. There we go. Look. All the fish in those round barrels. They look particularly not the sensible way to store fish in those barrels. I wonder if that will focus. Clearly not. In little round tubs. I had a talk with one of the trawler owners, who told me, among other things, that the trawler crews were still a race apart, perhaps the last of the wild men in this tamed island of ours, fellows capable of working day and night without food and sleep when the occasion demanded it, and then also capable of going on the booze with equal energy and enthusiasm. They are intensely loyal to their skippers, he told me, but do not give a damn for anybody or anything else. I could not help thinking it a shame that somebody does not give us a film about these men slaving and roaring away round the corner, just as a change from an anachronistic Wild West heroes or gangsters or gangster gutter rats. The existence of such fellows, not yet forced into the dreary pattern of cockney clerks and shop walkers, is yet one more reason for preserving our fishing industry. Let us, for sanity's sake, keep some variety in our manhood. We could also do with more variety in our menus. I was shown several varieties of fish here that were quite useless for the home market because the English, even the poorest, will not touch them. They are reshipped to the continent, where folk are either wiser or less fastidious. One of these rejected fish was that horny pink fellow known in the trade as the swaddy, which of course is old-fashioned slang for soldier. I heard a story of one trawler skipper hailing another in the northern seas and asking from where he had come. "From Aldershot," was the reply, in deepest disgust. "I've got nothing so far but a load of so-and-so swaddies." Kits of these fish have been sold that morning at 3 shillings each, and there would be easily enough in each kit to feed a large family for a week. I'm not suggesting that any family should try to feed itself for a week on this fish, but there's nothing wrong with it. The French, whose palate is at least as good as ours, at least as good as ours, that's interesting, make great use of it. And I fancy I've eaten it myself in France, and it seems strange that this and a few other perfectly edible fish should be totally rejected in a country where so many people are miserably living on bread and margarine. All the time I was shown the huge ice factory and the fish mill and the oil factories, I was wondering whether it was not possible for an enterprising Ministry of Health to tackle this problem of diet, not in order to bully a lot of poor folk into eating things they do not want to eat, but in order to give the more enterprising housewives among them an opportunity of getting clear of the wretched tea and bread and margarine and fried potato fare without spending any more money. It seems ridiculous that every day tons and tons of quite edible and wholesome fish should be brought here and then exported at cheap rate simply because there is against such fish a popular prejudice dating probably from the good old give me a thick beefsteak days when we were all hard at work and could live like lords. I was glad to have had a chance of exploring Hull, even if only in the most perfunctory fashion. It remains in my memory as a sound and sensible city, not at all glamorous in itself, yet never far from romance, with Hanseatic League towns and icebergs and the Northern Lights only just round the corner. I do not know if they have much music there, but if they do, they should insist upon hearing the symphonies and tone poems of I can't read his name. Sibelius. Sorry, it took me a time to get to Sibelius. If these were played long and loudly enough, I can imagine the stacked timber creaking and stirring and perhaps suddenly putting out a green shoot, and the seemingly dead halibut raising their vast heads. That this paragraph will annoy the typical citizen of Hull who prides himself on being a plain and downright fellow, I have no doubt whatever, but he should give it a chance, for he is not so plain and downright as he would have us believe, and neither is that city of his. Let's have a pause there. Have a slurp of tea at the same time. Linda Kane, Francis Firth. Let's just go back up there. Dean Cooper, it was a lovely picture of a gentleman rolling a barrel. That's what I'm famous for, being a Cooper barrel maker. Yes, of course, that's in your name. That's right. Julie says, good morning, everyone. Back in the day when we had the luxury of access of cheap charity shops, I bought a delightful book I've started reading in quarantine, Francis Frith's West Sussex. Ah, yes, Francis Frith. That he was a curious fella, and we owe a lot to him to have those images all around the country that he took. Beautiful, as Linda Kane has so rightly said. Technorama, good morning from sunny Essex. I lied about the sun. Oh, there we were, getting very envious then. Dean Cooper, the fish were squashed in and covered with salt to preserve them. Ice machines were not used back in those days, but they were used. They obviously had ice, but not from machines, because he talks about the ice. Charity shops. I was dreaming if I could get my baby some new toys from a charity shop the other day, says the lovely Julia. Thrift was the founder of a huge photographic archive, still available online, featuring villages, racecourse and churches. Yeah, you just try using them in your videos, though. They seem to cost an absolute bloody fortune, which is a shame when you're an impoverished YouTube filmmaker. Mark Donny McLeod says, I was Ramiboo. Were you Ramiboo? Linda Kane, what a shame they are such a good source for children's stuff. Yes, obviously unable to regulate, blah, blah, blah. Dean Cooper, a lot of Bradley's... I can't talk about that. Marvellous. You keep talking, I'll keep reading. A short but somewhat complicated train journey, I think that's supposed to be, took me to Lincoln. Fog descended upon the brief afternoon, and there were patterns of frost everywhere. I stamped my feet on the deserted station platforms. Under dim lights, I travelled in old and empty railway carriages, which rumbled into the dark plain of Lincolnshire, and I peered through the misted windows at mysterious little stations. It was not a journey in this year, this life. I felt like a family solicitor in a mid-Victorian novel, something like Wilkie Collins or Charles Reade, probably going to some remote grange to read a tortuous and sinister will. It was quite dark when I arrived at Lincoln itself, and so there was no chance of seeing once again from the train that splendid apparition of the Cathedral on the hill. There was a strange taxi on duty at the station. It was very tall and very old, furnished inside with red leather tassels too, and the general effect was that of a club library. In this queer apartment, perfect for visiting Dean, I climbed the steep hill to the top, for my hotel was near the cathedral. This hotel was a surprise. It was comfortable and civilised. Once inside, I became myself again. After settling in and indulging in that preliminary prowl familiar to all travellers, I inquired for the proprietor to congratulate him on his hotel, only to learn that he was away. He is, it seems, a Jew, and I was told that this was not his only hotel in the city. A very smart man, they all said. I could not help reflecting on the odd prominence of Jews in the history of Lincoln. The oldest house in the place is the Jew's house, and in the Middle Ages the Jews of Lincoln were notorious for their supposedly gruesome pastimes. And now, in the 20th century, it is a Jew who controls the hotel business here and makes his money looking after the tourists who come to see the cathedral and the Jew's house. I should like to read the history of the Jews in Lincoln. As this was not the tourist season, there were very few other guests in the hotel. Most of them, I gathered, were there on educational business, and I was delighted to see a couple of examiners cracking a bottle instead of cracking my own poor husk of knowledge. Before the fire in the lounge, I struck up an acquaintance with an engineer of about my own age who was having a drink there. It appeared that we had a common friend. He invited me to call at his house, which was only a few hundred yards away, later in that evening, and I went. Once outside the hotel, when you were walking in that medieval city, and might have been in the twisted, dark and icy old Paris of Villion that lives forever in the imagination, it was bitterly cold, and the steep streets, it was bitterly cold, and the steep streets as slippery as glass. The house I was bound for was on the very edge of the hill, and at that hour, in that light, it might have been clinging to the frozen face of an Alp. We had some good talk. Both of the men present were much travelled engineers. One of them, I'm doing it again, I'm putting words that are not there. I'm looking at the words, but I'm putting in words that are absolutely not there and reading the words I think are there, which are not there, which is a peculiar malady of mine. We had some good talk. Both of the men present were much travelled engineers. One knew the East very well. The other knew North America and Russia. I remember a party we had in Kharkov. The latter began one reminiscence by saying, and it seemed to me a perfect opening phrase. Neither was a Lincoln man, but they had both been there for some years. I was laughed at for assuming, on the word of guidebooks, that Lincoln made... One moment, please. I feel much better for that. I was laughed at for assuming, on the word of the guidebooks, that Lincoln made agricultural implements. This, it seems, is a standing joke, for the fact is that the city has long ceased to make agricultural implements on any scale worth mentioning. But on the other hand, it does manufacture things like big excavators, pumps, and oil engines. I wonder what an oil engine is. The tanks used in the war were made here, but not near where we're standing at the top of the hill which is the ancient city dominated by the cathedral. The manufacturing in Lincoln lies at the bottom of the hill by the side of the railway. It appears that there is a great local snobbery about this hill. To be anybody in Lincoln, you must live uphill, like my host and his friend, who nearly sent themselves into social oblivion in their innocence by first considering residence on the mere plain. Maids wanting a job point out that they have uphill experience and so demand uphill mistresses. In short, a successful social life in Lincoln is essentially uphill work. Good pun. You labour down below in the clanging 20th century, and you spend your leisure by the side of the cathedral in the 12th century. I was astonished to learn that the local council had recently pulled down some ancient buildings there and were contemplating further destruction, much to the indignation of my companions, although they were not natives themselves and neither antiquities or aesthetic. A person who is of an aesthetic persuasion is a aesthetes. How do you pronounce that? Aesthete. Aesthetes must be people who have an aesthetic persuasion. Aesthetes. He's used that word a number of times, and every time I look at it, I think it's not a word I ever use or have ever seen before. Aesthetes. Aesthetes. I'm not sure what that is. They grumble a good deal about the stupidity of the municipal authorities, but were rather surprised when I suggested that they should try and get on the council themselves. I've noticed this before, that there exists everywhere a large class of these sensible grumbling citizens, fully aware of what a town council should do or should not do, who never think of offering themselves as prospective councillors. Well, I think that's very true. Hang on. Aesthete, thank you. And neither aesthetes. It's a curious word that is not in my normal vocabulary, but I must start to use it. An aesthete. What's the dictionary definition? Diane Patton, oil engine is probably the first internal combustion engine using heavily oil as a fuel. Yes, I suppose that must be true. Next morning, I set out early to explore the old town. There was a wind straight from Siberia stinging this summit. Not another tourist in sight, and the inevitable shops filled with brass door knockers and toasting forks looked very forlorn. I've not been to a shop that sold toasting forks for a long time, or ever. Who are the people who load themselves with this trumpery brass in every cathedral city? Trumpery brass. Isn't that lovely? I must get some trumpery brass. There were very few citizens about either. There were men in little zinc baths. What? There were men, with little zinc baths suspended round their necks, all busy throwing sand on the grassy slopes, down which you lean rather than walk. It is odd that in the middle of this immense flatness we should have a town with streets that seem steeper than any we have elsewhere. A good deal of the exterior of the cathedral has been restored, and it is nothing like so impressive close to as it is at a right distance, a mile or two away on the plain. But that is not so damaging a statement as it might first appear, for few things in this island are so breathlessly impressive as Lincoln Cathedral, notably crowning its hill, seen from below. It offers one of the Pisgah sites of England. Here's a word somebody can look up. Pisgah. Pisgah? That must be somebody's name. It's got a capital P. Pisgah. One of the Pisgah sites of... And I probably mispronounced that. It's probably much less piss in it than I've said. There is, it seems, gleaming in the sun. There it seems, gleaming in the sun, are the very ramparts of heaven. And there's a picture here that's worth having a pause whilst I try and get my eye to work on the bloody text. There we are, Lincoln Cathedral. How about that? Amazing. That was the west front, apparently. Anybody got Pisgah yet? Never heard of it. It's a hanging tree in a garden. Oh, aesthete, a person who is appreciative and sensitive to art and beauty. Oh yeah, a noun. Person who affects great love of art. Oh yes, probably not me then. I would like to be an aesthete, but I'm more of a... So I was going to be rude then. Pisgah, yes. Spell again. It says Pisgah. You've got it. Yeah, that's it. Never heard of it. No, that's right. Pisgah. Pisgah. Capital letter, like somebody's name. Pisgah of England. What was the phrase? Lost it now. It offers one of the Pisgah sites of England. I wonder if he's an artist. Is he an artist? Mountain range of ancient Moab, says Clint. Oh, right, a mountain range of... Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you for that. That east wind, however, blew all thoughts of idling in the Minster yard out of my mind. I was not sorry to join my engineer acquaintance of the previous evening, who had promised to take me into the other Lincoln, smoking and spluttering below, and there show me the big excavators his firm was making. We dropped out of the Middle Ages and ran into a little industrial area, as typical of our own time as anything that could be imagined. These giant excavators, which sink their great steel teeth into the earth and bite away tons and tons of it in a few minutes, are brutal fellows, and making them is a brutal job. Massive chunks of solid steel have to be planed and drilled to provide the parts for these machines. There is about such processes to be mere ignorant onlooker. Sometimes his sentence construction is odd. There is about such processes to a mere ignorant onlooker a controlled ferocity that is rather frightening. We make a metal harder than any of our ancestors ever knew, and then we proceed to cut and shape it as if it was made of much pine wood. You feel in places like these that we have harnessed devils and demons that might break loose at any moment and begin planning and drilling everything within sight, ourselves included. I saw one machine that was cutting out the teeth in a large cogwheel, and this machine required no supervision whatsoever, but once set in motion, quietly went cutting out teeth until the wheel was finished. There is no need to describe the excavators themselves, as most people by this time must have seen them at work. Probably talking about JCBs, isn't he? Or what we now call JCBs, which is probably the name of the firm that made one of them and became very popular and is now an acronym or whatever. But here, they were bigger than the ones I've ever seen before, and I was shown a few giants. One monster I examined at some length, and went into the steel cab to see the controls, which was so ingenious that the enormous brute could easily be handled by one man, and not necessarily, I imagine, a very intelligent or experienced man. Yet this one machine could do the work of 800 navvies. This is a small fact that throws a sharply focused light on the industrial world of today. At one stroke, 800 manual labourers are obliterated. I do not protest against this fact. What little navvying I did during the war I heartily disliked. Yet the steel monsters do it let the steel monsters do it by all means. But I cannot believe that an industrial and economic system which assumes that 800 men are shoveling away and are drawing wages and are buying food can possibly continue to function properly when the 800 men have been dismissed and in their place is a solitary machine that only asks for one man and a regular heavy feed of engine oil. In other words, machines of this kind are obviously revolutionising industry, and if we want to avoid a complete breakdown, it seems to me that our economics will have to be revolutionised too. The trouble is, it would appear that our engineers are miles ahead of us and already living professionally in one world, while the rest of us are living, or trying to live, in another world. Either they must stop inventing, or, what is more sensible, the rest of us must begin thinking very hard. It's very true, that, isn't it? It's that whole business about people keep inventing new things to improve life, and we've all got used to one way of doing it, and we've got a labour force that's doing that. And then, look at the internet. In comes the internet, and newspapers are sort of almost thrown to the wind. But at the same time, of course, new jobs and professions come in, such as people like me on YouTube, who are trying to find how you make this really pay, but you couldn't do this before. Some of these machines have been adapted for trench digging, and I was told that a number of them have been sold to at least 2 foreign governments for that purpose. This is not quite as bad as the armament ramp, in which the very people who tell you that their country is in danger are also busy selling the other folk the very stuff that constitutes the danger. But nevertheless, it made me think a bit. There is something particularly idiotic about the present state of things. If there is always a real danger of war, and of course this was 1933, so just before the war of the Second World War, if there really is a real danger of war, then why do governments allow implements of war to be exported, possibly to be used against us? That argument is still strong today, isn't it? If there is no real danger of war, then why do governments allow such implements to be imported or spend a penny on them? As it is now, we seem to regard armaments or machinery with a military use as so many toys or sporting goods, as if they were of no graver importance than a tennis racket or golf balls. And yet the most of us know very well that there are serious differences between Wimbledon and modern warfare. But the nations go on playing a sort of lunatic game, cosily exchanging and accumulating weapons of dreadful destruction. I do not include excavators among these, though, as I have suggested to my guide, they could be very damaging weapons of offence on occasion. He agreed, and told me how one of their men, who had taken a machine somewhere out east, discovering that the corrupt native police had arrested his native assistants in order that they should buy themselves out, promptly moved his great excavator over to the police station and threatened to set it going if the men were not released. The police, rightly jumping to the conclusion that this terrible machine would utterly destroy their station in about 4 bites, gave way at once. It would be a bad day for Lincoln if all these excavators suddenly went mad, for they would tear up the lower town in an hour or two. The fear of modern inventions and machines, and here we are with artificial intelligence being our fear of modern inventions and things. It's I guess, was ever thus, as they say. Let's have a look at some of these comments. Did we ever find out? Oh, yes, that was a region, a mountain region, was it? Literally a peak, height, the name of Mount Nebo, from which Moses saw the promised land. Oh, okay. I don't know if I've pronounced it right, but never mind. Yes, Linda, that's why I wanted him to spell it again, as I knew that one. Just didn't think I heard him right. Oh, okay, yeah, no, that was right. So Isaac Newton was born in Lincolnshire and lived at Woolsthorpe Manor National Trust, where the offspring of the famous apple tree is. Oh, right. An oil engine is a predecessor of the diesel engine. Oh, I see. Is that oil as opposed to petrol or diesel, I guess? Pigsgar, Ceredigion, a small village in Wales, says Stephen Ruff. I've been to Ceredigion. Don't remember much about it, other than they spoke Welsh a lot. Funny when I Google it, only brings up one that we have here south of Eugene that people go hiking and riding up. Technology took my original trade in the printing industry, and I guess it will always be that. That's interesting, Adrian. I was in the printing industry when I left school. I worked on litho printing, on a make a plate and put it on the machine. I operated a Multilith 1250, if that means anything to you. But across the road, they had one of those platen printers, the proper one with type. Typeset? Proper type that you put in all the words and stuff, and the big rollers would come down like that. However they do that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. Whereas my Multilith would go like that, but not as nice as the original platen printer. The point about the engineering being ahead is very true. Yeah, the engineers being ahead, because they can dream, can't they, based on what they already know. So that's it. Do you mean that Google brought up? Oh, okay. The famous River Don, 12,000 HP steel rolling machine was one of 4 built, which we sold to the Japanese. Ben Reeve, funnily enough, when Mark Williams recorded Industrial Revelations 1 of the 5 Giants was missing. Oh, right. How interesting. Why would our people sell arms to other countries? Money, money, money. Yeah. Beasts, not beats. Did I misread it? Probably. It is part of our history, our generation after generation see the end of the world in new technology. That's right. It is the end of their part of the world. I was a plate maker, says Turbo Stream. Oh, there you go. Have run Multilith 1252. Yeah, great little machines, aren't they? That was the first, when I was 15 and left school. We had one of these Multilith 1250, and it was on the 3rd floor of a building in the Carfax in Horsham. How they got this bloody thing into this sort of what obviously at some point was somebody's living quarters many, many, many moons ago, and it was in this sort of back room, and I can still see the room with papers and ink and all of this everywhere, and you'd get the thing going and it would bloody scum up. You haven't got enough water in there, proper water and all that. And I would go down and make a plate with a camera, all of that stuff, and back in the day, and use the various different chemicals. And I remember we used to use something called MEK to clean the rollers afterwards, especially if you were trying to clean the black off because you wanted to print in yellow, and you had to match Pantone 304. Oh, and you clean the rollers, and a tiny bit of black would come from nowhere and streak through, and it would be just an absolute pain. Dear, oh dear, Mark Donny, but the difference between robot and AI is that it can replace everybody from the highest to the lowest. Yes, I dare say it can. Dr. Stephen Hawkins gave a big warning about AI before he died. Turbo, we had one in our garage as Dad and I had a small printing business. Oh, how wonderful. Anyone remember the Gestetner duplicating machine? Oh, and what, the purple Spirit, was that one of the Spirit machines that had that, gave out that purple print, and you'd use it at schools. I've operated an old Heidelberg printing machine set up for embossing. Oh, fantastic. MEK. Yes. Oh my God, that was lethal, didn't it? Just dried your hands out if you had to have gloves on and all of this. They were the days. Good heavens, isn't it a small world? It's the end of the great part of the world, but completely after all those power and aspirin. It is the end of a great part of our world, but completely. After all, those in power and those aspiring to be will not be allowed to do so. Oh, yeah. Robots and AR are still a long way off from that, says the lovely Julia. MEK, methyl ethyl ketone. Is that what it was? MEK. I just know it as MEK. And that was, you'd clean it with all the other chemicals, whatever they were, I can't remember them. And then after that came MEK. And it was, yeah, it would take anything out. It was great. I worked in the office. Yes, a lot of copies. Lots of copies. Gone shopping. See you all later. Dean Cooper. DMC. DMC. Dean Martin Cooper. That's right. DMC. Well done. MEK. Blimey. They are small world. Anyway, thank you very much for watching today's little reading. How much have we've got? We're in part 3. You must be going off to Norfolk shortly. So, yeah. We'll get on to that. Thank you very much. All good fun. I must go and do some editing for a video. And we will resume tomorrow. Do you know, it's funny because it is Saturday, isn't it? But very much losing the sense of a week. The days just follow. It's just like... It's like the week has no structure anymore. Use the gestetner for the... or gestetner. I can't remember now how we used to pronounce it. Yeah. MEK would get rid of COVID-19. Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah. Put that everywhere. Fudge cakes. Yeah. That was... I used to get the bromide that you would put the... I'm sure it was either the bromide you would put the negs in, or it was there was another chemical, not MEK, because I always wore gloves for MEK, but there was another chemical that you would use for cleaning with no, that's right. There was a chemical. There were 3 chemicals, I think, for setting the plates. That's right. We used to squirt them on and use some sort of wool, cotton wool type stuff, and you would do this with it. And it must have been, maybe it was the bromide or something. It used to make my hands, it turned them yellow, but I would have dermatitis on the back of using that, I remember. Linda Kane, thanks, Richard. Any ideas for the next book? Yes. Maybe you could make some suggestions, Linda. We could make one a bit more local. Perhaps we should do one a bit more local. See you tonight. Thank you very much. Another enjoyable reading. Thank you very much. No problem. Literally, MDM, 0 trolls here. Fantastic. Plate developer. Yeah, it used to make my fingers go yellow, like I smoked, million cigarettes a day with all the nicotine. It used to do that. And dermatitis. And I remember having to go to the doctors, and they gave me some cream. Horrible stuff. Horrible. I did it for about 2.5 years at this printing firm, and then I left. But it is funny, the smell of ink takes me right back there. Hasta Lego, Richard, lovely Julia and everybody. The state has said musicians can busk on the underground today, so off to get some pennies. Really? Isn't that amazing? Do you know, I think incrementally things are slowly being lifted. They're not going to change their stay at home, be safe, save lives, all of that. But I think incrementally the police have come out and said, yes, it is okay to drive somewhere and have a walk. And now if that's true, if they have said, the state has said musicians can busk on the underground, I think they are lifting these, but in a very subtle way. Oh, underground in Madrid. All right. Thanks. Okay. So I've just proved myself to be a stupid ass. Just forget that I came on air today. Oh dear. 30 years in the print trade for me. Might do a vid on it. You should. That would be interesting. Underground Metro. Yes, I've got it. I got it. The old brain. Anyway, I must go and put my head in a bucket of what is it? Can't remember. Quote from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and I can't remember the bloody animal. Hyena offal. Anyway, enough of this gay banter. It's nice to talk to you. Catch up with you soon. Take care. Have a good afternoon. Ta-ta for now. Bye-bye.